My Luftwaffe is invincible, and so now we turn to England. How long will this one last? 2, 3 weeks? The Luftwaffe was Nazi Germany's air force during World War II, and it lasted from 1935 to 1946. After World War I, with the restrictions of their military from the Treaty of Versailles, Germany secretly started rebuilding its military with soldiers, ships, and aeroplanes. When World War II broke out, the Luftwaffe was one of the most advanced air forces in the world, which meant that in any air battle, they would have the advantage. However, towards the end of the war, the Luftwaffe lost the advantage and was finally defeated in 1945. The Luftwaffe gained and lost the advantage in World War II because of their condensed training, their use of tactics, and their failed military experiments. The Luftwaffe spent the years before World War II preparing for battle, but as the war dragged on, they had to shorten the training time for new recruits. Most of the pilots at the beginning of the war joined from Lufthansa, a flying club, or were already in the Luftwaffe and had combat experience. Those from flying clubs were trained to fly single-seat aerobatic gliders and single-seat planes, which were civilian versions of the feature aircraft of the Luftwaffe. The pilots that were already in Luftwaffe had participated in the Spanish Civil War, where they were able to test tactics and equipment that would become the standard issue in World War II. Germany also trained pilots to fly in international air competitions. Some of these pilots would become the best aces in the Luftwaffe. However, as the war continued, the training for recruits had to be shortened due to lack of frontline pilots. Some of the replacement pilots had less than 80 hours in an aircraft, which is not nearly enough to know how to fly like an ace. Although training is important, the way the pilot uses tactics determines the winner. In addition to training, the Luftwaffe had poor use of tactics. Before the war started, while the Luftwaffe was still rearming themselves, they started to develop tactics to use in battle. In 1936, Hitler sent a unit of volunteers from the Luftwaffe to aid the Spanish nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. Up until then, the Luftwaffe had not had a chance to use the newly devised tactics, so this was an important opportunity. The unit sent to Spain was able to test new ground support tactics and new flight tactics. The Luftwaffe learned that the ground troops are the most vulnerable to attack when they are moving. The pilots also developed new tactics for formations. However, due to limited air operations, the Luftwaffe was unable to test many aerial tactics. After the Spanish Civil War, the Luftwaffe started to plan their conquest using the tactics they refined. On September 1st, 1939, they put their tactics to the test. Germany started the war with an attack on Poland, and the Luftwaffe played a big part. The Luftwaffe used a tactic called blitzkrieg. They were able to destroy the Polish Air Force within 24 hours. Using blitzkrieg, the Luftwaffe would work in sync with the Wehrmacht and they would destroy targets that would hinder the enemy from responding to the attack. Though the blitzkrieg attack was successful in mainland Europe, it was not effective against Britain. Before the invasion of Britain, the Luftwaffe turned to a new tactic. They decided to first bomb coastal cities that would be in the landing area for Operation Sea Lion, then bomb the airfields and factories of the RAF, then bomb cities such as London. However, once the operation began, the Luftwaffe changed their priorities, focusing on bombing civilian targets in cities, which would prove to be a fatal flaw. Without the constant bombing of airfields, the RAF was still able to defend against the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe objective to create chaos and demoralize the people of Britain proved difficult to achieve. After months of trying to break Britain, the Luftwaffe stopped the raids and Operation Sea Lion was scrubbed. When America entered the war, they started to send bombers over to England to begin the strategic bombing campaign. At this point, the Luftwaffe switched from an offensive role to a defensive role. However, the Luftwaffe had not really practiced defensive tactics. This new role brought new strategies, and since they were at war, the pilots had little time to practice them. As such, the tactics they developed for defense were not as successful as the ones they developed before the war. One way they defended against bombers was to fire rockets into the bomber groups to disperse them, and then shoot down the stragglers that fell behind the group. Although in a way it worked, it wasn't enough to stop the Allies from bombing occupied Europe. Towards the end of the war, the Luftwaffe High Command formed a fighter group called Sturmgruppe. The objective of this group was to shoot down every aircraft they met. They were made up of modified FW-190s, and their tactic was to hit the formations head-on and dive in on the groups. If all else failed, they were to ram the tails of the bomber with their own planes, bailing out right before impact. This strategy failed because of the low numbers of bombers shot down and high casualty rate. The tactics at the end of World War II were very unsatisfying compared to the tactics they used at the beginning of the war. In addition to tactics, the Luftwaffe made poor choices on weapon development during the war. When war broke out, Germany was a leader in weapon design and technology. However, as the war progressed, Germany started to fall behind the Allies in developing new weapons and vehicles. Before World War II, when Germany was rearming, many companies that built cars and passenger planes were submitting military plans for planes to the Luftwaffe. Some of these companies were Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Junker. These planes were some of the most technologically advanced planes of the time. When war began, the Allies had to catch up. They finally began to meet the standards that the Luftwaffe had set in the Battle of Britain. Before the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had not yet met a formidable air force, but the Royal Air Force that opposed the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1940 had planes that were comparable to the Luftwaffe's. The Luftwaffe was using the Messerschmitt Bf-109E as a fighter and the Heinkel HE-111 as the frontline bomber. The RAF was using two types of planes. The first was the Supermarine Spitfire, which was used as a dogfighter, and the Hawker Hurricane, which was used as a defensive weapon, and mainly attacked enemy bombers. The Luftwaffe started to lose the advantage they gained pre-war during the series of aerial battles with the RAF. The Bf-109E had two MG-17s in the nose of the plane and above the engine, and either one MG-17 or a 20mm MG FF/M cannon in each wing. The Spitfire had 8 303 machine guns, 4 in each wing, and the Hurricane had 12 303 machine guns, 6 in each wing. This gave the upper hand to the RAF, and for the first time, the Luftwaffe was outgunned. As a result, Hitler had to give up on his plan to conquer Britain. After the Battle of Britain, the Allies continued to introduce new planes that rivaled those of the Luftwaffe. This meant that the Luftwaffe needed newer and more advanced planes to counter the Allied aircraft. This necessity led to the beginning of the jet age, and the Luftwaffe began to experiment with jet propulsion. Jet propulsion is when the engine takes air in, compresses the air, adds fuel, and combusts the mixture to eject the gases out of the rear of the engine faster than the air around the plane. The Luftwaffe successfully developed the Messerschmitt Me-262, the first jet fighter. The Luftwaffe developed the 262 in 1938 and first flew on July 18, 1942. Production problems had the debut of the fighter prolonged to June of 1944. If the plane was put on the front line earlier, it may have given back the upper hand to the Luftwaffe, and the war may have gone a different direction. The weapons the Luftwaffe focused to expand on did the opposite of what they were hoping to accomplish. They lost the upper hand because of how they attempted to develop their air force. The Luftwaffe lost the advantage of World War II because of their lack of training, their insufficient weapons, and their unsatisfying tactics. This is important because this is why the Allies were able to control the sky, which led to the Allied victory of Europe and the defeat of the Nazi regime. The decisions the Luftwaffe brought upon themselves in World War II ultimately cost them the war.